My husband and I started playing World of Warcraft Classic a few months after it was launched. At the time, I didn't know anything about the game, or MMOs in general, but my husband played a bit of Original Wrath and MoP, so he knew enough to get us started. After looking up a few guides, he decided to play a warrior so he could tank dungeons while leveling. Healing immediately caught my attention because I was told that it's a challenging role, so I decided to try Resto Shaman. We had another friend who decided to play Mage, so we both picked Trolls, and my husband picked Orc to level in the same starting zone as us. Of course, we found out later that Warrior and Shaman were the best classes you could play in vanilla, and it definitely fed into our already competitive mindset. This was the first MMO that I had ever gotten past level 8 and not quit. However, once leveling was slowing down around level 40, my husband and I lost interest while our friend continued to reach max level and eventually raid. A few weeks later, he convinced us to come back and tried to quote-unquote boost us in ZF and BRD until we were level 60. This was before we knew anything about boosting, but this is actually the reason we are still playing World of Warcraft to this day. I'm glad that we made it to level 60, because everything that happened after got us very hooked into the game. We started off in a casual guild that had just killed Ragnaros, the last boss of MC, which was the current content at the time. Our mage friend had already been raiding with that guild for a few weeks before we started playing again, and he suggested we join his guild. I was actually only level 56 in my first raid because they desperately needed healers, and we continued our adventures for the next few weeks before we found out about Warcraft logs and more of the competitive side of this game. Of course, as the tryhards we were, this discovery opened up a new exciting part of the game for us, and eventually led us to realize that the guild we were in was no longer competitive enough for us. At the time on our server, Grobulus, there was only one competitive guild on Horde, called Final Boss. This was a mega guild that consisted of 3 to 4 raid teams, which was a lot, considering each raid team consists of 40 raiders, and yeah, you can just do the math. They were known for hardcore progression and claiming every realm first so far. So shortly after we joined Final Boss, they decided to also start a speedrun team. Somehow my husband and I were high performing enough to make the team, and that is where our sweatiness in WoW all started. Soon after the team was formed, we were told to level split alts, which were alts that pretty much only existed to serve the purpose of funneling loot to our mains. We split the mains up into 2 raids and filled the other half with alts, so that as a raid team we have double the chances of getting loot. While leveling our split alts, we discovered boosting, and this is actually where our army of alts started. On top of split raiding, many of the raiders hosted their own Oni pugs with a Deathbringer reserved, which was the best weapon at the time for DPS warriors. This was when I started hosting pugs myself to help my husband get his weapon, and then eventually started hosting GDKPs so that we could play more of our alts outside of main raid. So anyway, at the start of every month, there was an event called the Darkmoon Faire, which consisted of many different events. But the only one we were concerned about as a speedrun team was the DMF buff, which was an additional world buff that gave you an extra 10% damage. When the buff was around, these were the weeks where we would combine all our mains into the same raid and try to push for a record speed clear with the extra buff. During the rest of the month, we were split raiding to farm for gear. We were decently successful with speedrunning during BWL. But fast forward to the end of the BWL phase, Zul'Gurub was not really a serious raid tier, so we didn't care too much to practice for it. Funny enough, we put together a last-minute group of 20 to compete for Realm First. And we actually lost half our world buffs on just the snake boss because no one knew the mechanics of the fight, and half of us just got shocked and died. After a few wipes on Hakar, we still ended up claiming Realm First because no one else on the server cared about this phase either. During the entirety of the ZG phase, we were just split raiding and prepping for the next big progression race, which was going to be AQ40. At the time, Blizzard didn't put up their official PTR for AQ, so we had to practice on a very old and scuffed private server. The values weren't accurate, and some of the fights were outdated, but it still served its purpose, allowing us to learn and practice the mechanics before the start of the next tier. So when the phase came around, it was time for the famous opening of the gates of Ahn'Qiraj. I didn't know this when I first joined the guild, but apparently one of the biggest guild goals when it was formed was to obtain as many Scarab Lords as possible before the gates opened.
Getting Scarab Lord requires a lot of people with a lot of time. So many people and so much time that even large guilds will usually opt to grind for just the one Scarab Lord. And for the most part, that was the case on Grobulus. One guild, one Scarab Lord target. However, my guild, Final Boss, let's just say we had bigger plans. Unquestionably the rarest mount in the game, even still to this day. You see, this mount can only be obtained by those that ring the Scarab Gong during the 10-hour event I mentioned earlier. And once the event is over, the mount can never be obtained ever again.
At first, I didn't want to go through so much effort just to get the mount, but once I heard that my raid leader was requiring every healer to do the entire questline just to get the Bis healer weapon from it, I completely changed my mind. I didn't want to have to go through all the trouble just to only get the weapon when I could just do it before the AQ opening and get the mount and title too. Some people didn't even have a choice. Our GM got to decide on a list of people that were deserving of it.
This is my guild Scarab Lord target list. If this looks long and ridiculous to you, that's because it is.
So the fact that I made the list and had the opportunity to get it convinced me to go for it even more. However, looking back at it, completing this questline within 2 weeks was one of the biggest reasons why it was so much more of a headache. After the first Scarab Lord was announced, our raid team had until the 10-hour war was finished to prepare for the AQ40 Realm First race, the actual thing that my raid team was interested in. At this point, our roster for the race was already set, and we had already practiced as much as possible, so it was finally time to execute. We needed to go get all our world buffs. Speaking of world buffs, World PvP was very big during Vanilla Classic, and once people figured out that you could purge people's world buffs, many people dedicated their life to leveling priests just to purge people's world buffs. At the time, Grobulus was an alliance-dominated server as well, so it was pretty hard for us to fight back when they always outnumbered us. People would literally keep track of when the horde was dropping their Ani and Ren heads just so they could camp Org as a ghost and respawn to hit purge right as we logged in. In order to unflag from PvP so that they couldn't target you, you needed to sit in a friendly town for 5 minutes, which was way too long. During those 5 minutes, you could get purged, and if you didn't, you would rot 5 minutes of your precious buffs. So to counter the purging, we found creative ways to unflag ourselves without rotting the timer on our buffs or risking it. The strat I used was to summon myself to a friendly flight path, start flying to another friendly town, because that immediately unflags you. Then I would summon myself back to Org immediately. That way I could unflag within seconds and become safe from all the purging. The DMF buff was the worst one, because sometimes it was located in Elwyn Forest, which was an alliance-controlled zone, so there was no way for us to unflag. I ended up using a BG queuing strat, where we would queue for a BG when there were minimal alliance at the area. Then once the queue popped, we would in this pot over to the buff, quickly grab it, then take the queue. Once we got into the queue, we would just instantly quit, unflag, and log off. It was a tedious process, but it was necessary with how much we were being targeted by competing alliance guilds. At the time, I really hated how annoying people were, and I just wanted to be left in peace. But once World PvP started dying later in TBC and in Wrath, I kind of missed how alive the World PvP made Classic feel. So anyway, we ended up winning Rome First AQ40 and just kept split rating and speedrunning throughout the rest of the phase. The real competition was going to be Naxx, because for Classic standards, it was going to be the most difficult raid yet. We started practicing for it very early and still had trouble with some of the bosses such as Patchwork, Four Horsemen, Saffron, and KT. Saf was actually very difficult to do on day 1 because we had no real frost resist gear. We had to save up whatever green quality frost resist gear we could find with no other stats. And we ended up killing it with 13 healers, which was a lot more than we usually need. We actually ended up not only winning Rome First, but also getting World 5th on Horde, which was the biggest accomplishment we had ever achieved throughout the game so far. After the race, we stopped split rating because a lot of people wanted to just kill KT and quit the game. We ended up losing quite a few good players because they didn't want to continue into TBC. And honestly, my husband and I were also considering quitting. But our raid leaders convinced us to keep playing because they said they were planning on splitting from Final Boss and reforming as an even sweatier guild to compete at the world level. So we reluctantly agreed to keep playing. This time it was serious business because we were already practicing for the first 2 phases of TBC when there were still 3 months left of vanilla. We started talking about getting our warrior mains to reroll to warlocks and hunters because they were going to be the meta classes in TBC. We started leveling and gearing those characters and carried them in our Naxx raids as well. When pre-patch finally came out, we started boosting all our future paladin mains as a guild. We barely slept just so we could get them to level 60 and make sure they don't miss any raid logouts. Our plan was to get them as geared as possible to level quickly in TBC and race for a world ranking on tier 4 progression. We even spent hours trash farming AQ40 so that they could have enough rep to turn in and get their gear from the raid. After months of prep and practice, the day we had been waiting for had finally come. The launch of TBC. Stay tuned as the story will continue in part 2 of this series. Don't forget to like and subscribe, turn on the notification bell so that you won't miss it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video.